It really wasn't until 2014 when all of a sudden the World Health Organization called it a crisis that anyone started to really listen. Unfortunately, it's a few years down the road, and so the bacteria have had a chance to really, develop and evolve this resistance and then spread worldwide, and now we're just trying to play catch up.
Jason Tetro is a microbiologist, a best-selling author, and the host of the popular new podcast, The Super Awesome Science Show. He's a guy who has a real knack for making science understandable and interesting. We touched on a bunch of topics, and it was a lot of fun to get to speak with him. This is my conversation with Jason Tetro. Jason, Germ Guy Tetro, thanks very much for making the time to speak with me today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
So I believe we first met, it was at a science conference or a science communications conference about a year and a half ago. I don't know if you recall that.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's great to finally meet science communicators face to face, and that way you get a feel for, what we all do, and it really helps to develop our community.
Great to have you on the show. And we were just chatting about podcasts off the air a second ago. And I want to congratulate you on the launch of yours. There's, I think, 600,000 podcasts out there and counting, but the number of good ones you could probably count on a couple of hands, or like in terms of great ones. So I just want to say congrats. And I was listening to the one you did on pathogens today. And what's your experience been so far? Why did you decide that you wanted to launch one? What's the experience been over the first half dozen sort of episodes or so?
Well, the whole point of doing a podcast really came up as an idea about a year ago. I've been in the media now for over 10 years. I published a couple of best-selling books. But really, it came down to the idea that there's so much more in science than what I was really sharing. Microbiology, immunology, it's really a wide open topic. And I could probably talk about those every single day, all day, and still not, run out of ideas. But there was a time that I actually sat down, and this was a few years ago, with one of your previous guests on the show, Erica M.
Oh, right.
And she explained to me that being niche is great, but that I'm going to have this emotional moment where I'm realizing that my niche isn't enough. And that happened to me last year. And I realized that, for all that I'm doing for microbiology and immunology, what if I had the opportunity to be able to do this for all science? I mean, we're surrounded by science. Every single person who's listening right now is a scientist in their own right. We all conduct experiments. I mean, have you ever driven on the highways?
Every day, yeah.
Yeah. So some days you're going to take the Gardiner, some days you're going to take the 401, and some days you're just going to go right through the city and take the streets based on what you see. And sometimes the decision that you make will be a good one. You'll get there when you want to get there, and sometimes it'll be a bad one. I remember deciding one day I'm going to take university and ended up getting stuck in a traffic jam and was late. And at that point, I made a decision that maybe taking that particular route may not be my best option. Well, even though we're talking about this from a real life perspective, the reality is that these are experiments. We conduct experiments every single day. We learn from the outcomes of those experiments, and then we figure out ways to be able to perform better experiments to get better results. That's science. And so what ends up happening is that if we can look at science that way, then we realize that it really is a part of who we are. And quite honestly, to sort of give you an idea as to why we called the show what it is, it's awesome. Because when people open their eyes and they see this, then they realize, wow, science really has an impact on my life. And that's really where the show comes into play, is we're trying to find ways to show people how science matters to them. And in many cases, we give them something that they can use as soon as they finish listening to the podcast. We hope that they go on to listen to the whole podcast, of course.
So everyone's a scientist. I kind of get that, even if you're an English major or a garbage man or whatever the case may be.
Exactly.
But but I think you're being kind of generous to the general population, including myself. And I know what you mean in terms of those sort of experiments. But the kind of stuff that you are talking about on your show is, if you look at the themes, that they're pretty relevant. They're important. And people, I think, are curious by nature. And I think it was in the trailer to your podcast where you talked about the fact that there's all these discoveries coming up on a daily basis, but most of them are being ignored, and you wanted to kind of shine a spotlight on that. Why do you think it is that we're not just paying attention to these? Is there too much information? Is it too much Twitter, Donald Trump? Like why can't we get more? Or is it that the scientists making these awesome finds and discoveries are not great at communicating them?
Well, it's definitely not the latter. What you have to understand is that we are continually immersed in information. And there's only a limited amount of space for science. And it's been shrinking in the media for a very long time. So really what happens is people who are trying to communicate science are really finding themselves sort of in a distant environment. And unfortunately, much like Pluto, science continually seems to be demoted in its ability to affect us, and so we hear even less. So the problem that I'm hoping to sort of counter with the Super Awesome Science Show is really that science has had enough of being, demoted and called something that it really isn't, which is less. And the best way to do that, as I found, is, to show a little bit of attitude, to show a little bit of, sass. And so the Super Awesome Science Show is really called Sass. And what we're doing, and the slogan for the show really is, show them some sass.
Right.
Now, as for the scientists themselves, I've been in science for 30 years. And the whole idea of a scientist as a stereotype makes us seem like someone who probably would be a guest or an extra on The Big Bang Theory. Well, that's not really the case. These people are fantastic individuals. They're human, and they've got amazing ways of being able to communicate. What hasn't happened is giving them that opportunity by framing the picture so that they come out as human and have the opportunity to share their information in a human way so that it essentially is relatable to everybody. And that's really where I come in as the host of this show, is that I've experienced the best of both worlds. And so what I want to do is give the researchers, the guests on the show, an opportunity to really talk not only to me, but also to the listeners in a way that they probably wouldn't have expected could be possible.
I think what they would expect wouldn't be possible is that a scientist could communicate with them in a way that would be interesting and understandable. And while I agree, like scientists are fascinating people and doing some great work, I think that their ability to communicate in the way that we like to hear it is a little bit challenged. And in my day job, I work with scientists and people in the medical professions on a pretty regular basis, and their ability to sort of to steal a line from Jerry Maguire to you had me at hello. It's kind of tough because a lot of them, and correct me if you disagree, but I think a lot of them they communicate the same way they would do an experiment. They say, okay, here's what we're going to set out to do, and here's our methodologies, and here are all the experiments, and here's all the evidence, and here's all the proof. And then 3 days later, they get to the point, and we're used to hearing it kind of the other way around. Do you think there's a little bit of that's happening as well?
Well, that's the really interesting thing, is that when I talk to the guests, it really is about talking in an experimental way. It's just that we talk in English. And one of the shows that'll be coming up, we talk about this very, very complicated process. It's called, social desirability bias, in which we tend to say things that we believe everyone else is going to like, as opposed to what we actually believe. And what's really amazing is that, there was just recently a story in the media about that, where people are saying that they're getting all sorts of exercise. And the reality is, when you start looking at the data, that no, they're not. They're just real. Telling, yeah. So when I talked to the expert on this, Courtney Beer, she calls it something different. I mean, yeah, social desirability bias, SDB, right? Well, she calls it the Hermione effect. And we literally start off by talking about Harry Potter and the fact that Hermione Granger has a certain way of acting that really exemplifies what SDB is, and then we get into the science. See, the problem that happens when you're talking about science is that most scientists stick to that genre, to that niche, if you will, and then go on. But as soon as you open that up and you show the translational value first, then you can start getting into the experimental, because now you're taking everybody along for a ride.
So there are millions of scientists, obviously, out there. Let's just say even in North America.
Yeah.
If you ask the general person on the street to name as many scientists as you can, that number I'm thinking is going to be less than 6. Right?
Well, I mean, it might be 7 now, thanks to Donna Strickland, but I mean,
include yourself there too. You know what I mean? So,
yeah.
But I think it's the same. You know, the Bill Nyes, the Neil deGrasse Tysons, the Stephen Hawkings. You know, may he rest in peace, and you know, the David Suzuki's, and yeah, and I would include yourself in that list. I think, you know, to me, it's like you've seen an opportunity where these two things can converge. You know, the communication around science in an understandable and interesting way. I think if you can do that, that's you're going to be able to like share a lot of knowledge and really get a lot of traction in. And I applaud you for doing it in this way. I think podcasts are a fantastic way to get through to people. I'm curious about the Hermione effect. Can you describe to me how that applies to that character in Harry Potter? Because to me, she seemed like the only one who had her shit together. She did all her homework. She knew all the spells. So how does she demonstrate this SDB?
All right. So remember, I'm not the expert here. I'm the host. But what Courtney has pointed out, and you're going to hear in the podcast, is that depending on the situation that she's in, Hermione will give an answer that she feels is going to be the correct one. So if she's talking to Professor Snape, she may say something different than what she says to Dumbledore. And that may be different than maybe what she would say to Ron. And as a result of that, what she says comes out differently, but it has absolutely no impact on what she's actually going to do. So if she says, you know, I'm going to study my spells all night, and then realizes that, you know, there's a Quidditch match that she really wants to go to, she may still go and see that Quidditch match and maybe not study. And so that's how Hermione fits in. Now, for the average Canadian, as the recent CBC story showed, we say that we're going to be doing a lot of exercise. And yes, we get those, you know, hour, or I think it was 49 minutes every single day. But if you happen to put a pedometer on somebody, well, it's kind of less than 20.
So when you talk about this social desirability bias or the Hermione effect, is that would that include the sort of virtue signaling that we see all the time on social media and especially Twitter?
Oh, yes. And here's where it gets really interesting. And we do talk about this as well. We have influencers in our lives that we try and mimic. How many times have people Instagrammed something as a result of what Oprah has told them to buy, or Kim Kardashian, right? But the fact is that when it comes to how we're going to act, we may follow these particular influencers, and then when someone asks us, well, what are you doing to improve your life? You're going to use some study that you heard about that Al Roker talked about, as opposed to the reality, which is, you know, you're following Kim Kardashian. And so I think with social media, and I sort of challenge Courtney on this, you know, could we possibly use social media as a base to take out social desirability bias? And what she explained to me is that, believe it or not, even if you're doing a survey where there's nobody else in the room, but you know that it potentially could end up on social media, you're still going to fall to that bias.
So there's always that, even if you're in a room by yourself, it's almost like the Truman Show. Like you feel like someone's watching, or someone might end up seeing this, so you change your answers a little bit.
Oh, yeah. We don't actually go Truman Show. We go Castaway. Because quite honestly, and I have a feeling that there may be some debate that comes from this particular episode. Um, I say that Wilson is a perfect example of someone, if you will, because he really is a person, even though he's a volleyball, uh, who can act as that influence to make you decide to say something that maybe you won't follow through on.
This is getting deep. We got a volleyball with a bloody handprint on it is a character now. So there's not a lot of people. I think you're the first person I've ever met who is just so like fully immersed and gone all in germs. Why is that? Now I understand that you had some sicknesses as a kid, or you weren't. Yeah. You were in the hospitals a lot. Is that where it started?
Yeah, I mean, almost died when I was 4 years old.
No way. What happened?
Oh yeah. Oh, massive fever, went up above 105, was just a real nightmare. Constantly sick as a kid, always in the hospitals. When I did my tour for my book, The Germ Files, I would always say that, if you ever were at school and you saw that kid who was always sickly that you always felt sorry for, well, that was me in the 70s. And so what for me was the impetus to go into microbiology was I really just wanted to find out what was trying to kill me. Turns out it was just an adenovirus, and that there was probably ways to be able to prevent that from happening. But, I'm now 47, so it's a little late. But the thing is that when I started going into this idea of, bugs that could kill you, it was the early 80s. And there was one big bug that turned to be that seemed to be killing a whole bunch of people. I'm sure you remember it. Human immunodeficiency virus.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, of course. So when I was, I think, 14 years old, somewhere around those lines, I basically said, I want to try and find a cure for HIV. Everybody wanted to cure cancer. Everyone wanted to cure diabetes. Well, no, I wanted to cure HIV. Didn't do it, but I ended up getting what is now somewhere around 30 years in the research field, and I've never lost my love or my passion for it.
That's amazing. So that's kind of like your superhero origin story. That bacteria almost killed you, and then you spent the rest of your life dedicated to studying them. It's been said, people have said of you that you think that microscopic creatures that are all around us and within us get a bad rap. They have a bad reputation. Why is that?
Well, I mean, when you think about it, there are what we call pathogens, and we know a lot of them. We've heard of the salmonellas. We've heard of the ebolas. We know of the adenoviruses, although we didn't back in the 70s. And so the thing is that there's a number of them out there that are really, bad for us. And here's the thing. The amount of species, the amount of viruses, of bacteria, fungi, make up about 0.01% of the actual number of species that exist. So we've been spending a heck of a lot of time focusing on a very, very small percentage. Now, when I was at the University of Ottawa, I was studying environmental microbiology. And what we learned was that the other 99.99% happened to be not so bad. In fact, they could actually be good for you. And so when I was talking with Penguin Random House back in 2011, the editor at Doubleday essentially said, well, could we write a book about how to love germs? And I thought it was amazing. So that's basically how we developed the germ code. And then after that came out, there was obviously an appetite for this. So we created a new idea, which ended up being the Germ Files, which the Washington Post in their wonderful review said that it's kind of like a dating guide for germs. It's probably one of the best quotes I've ever heard when it comes to one of my books.
It would seem to me that a guy in your line of work would it seems like this would be like a perfect recipe for OCD, like just wearing gloves, washing your hands, or is it the total opposite that you have a better understanding of it, so you don't go that way?
Well, I mean, if I'm alone somewhere in the forest or the jungles, I don't really care because there's no pathogens there.
What
So
about
it's
on the
not
subway under at King Station in Toronto?
Yeah, that's when I'm carrying my hand sanitizer with me everywhere I
So
go.
do you actually carry that stuff around?
Oh yeah, absolutely. 62 to 70% alcohol. You put that on your hands for 15 seconds and boom, you're good to go. And quite honestly, we touch our faces somewhere around 15 to 20 times every single hour.
Really? Wow.
So the fact is that, you might want to keep those hands relatively clean. There's an idea that I have for another book, and I'm sort of talking with some editors now about the concept that the source of all of our pandemics in the past has been our hands.
There's one school of thought that says that we're cleaning too much and that this is the reason that kids are getting allergies and asthma and that kind of thing. Do you think that's bogus?
Not really. And here's why. When you are in an area that has a huge number of people, then you're going to be having all sorts of microbes being shared, and you're never quite sure who's sick. Even something like an airplane, I consider an airplane to be no different than an emergency room ward. It's just kind of that way when it comes to microbes. You're just not sure which pathogens are around and which ones are going to affect you. So what I essentially say is that when you're in a large environment like that, where there's so many people, then you're going to want to adhere to the best hygiene possible. That is targeted hygiene. Mm-hmm. Where we start getting into problems is the fact that in urban environments, what we have done is we've reduced the diversity of the microbes that we encounter on a daily basis. And since our immune systems require that contact with a diverse number of microbial species in the first few years of life in order for us to have, less chance of allergies, a better, people will say stronger, but it's actually more balanced immune system, you need that exposure. You just don't get that in urban environments. That's not because we're cleaning too much. It's simply because we've crowded the space with a smaller number of species. So rather than worrying about whether you should be cleaning too much, in those first few years of life, we should be getting our kids out of cities and into wonderful expanses where they can joyously experience microbial species. And hey, if you want to teach them to spin around and start singing The Hills Are Alive, I'm good with that.
I asked my sister, I don't know if you know, but I have a sister who's a reporter at the Globe and Mail. Her name's Carly Weeks.
Oh my God. Yeah, I didn't realize. Carly's awesome.
Yeah,
I love
we're related. Well, it's not give her too big of a head.
Okay.
I was chatting with her and I said, I'm going to be speaking with you. I said, what questions would she have for you as a health reporter? So one of the topics that she brought up that she's talking about quite a bit, and I'd love to get your input on, is the whole the sort of antibiotic resistant bacteria, that we are basically screwed. I don't know if that's clinical terminology or if you would agree with that.
Well, here's the thing. And first off, I just want to preamble this by saying back in 2014, I was very, very fortunate to be able to sort of collaborate, if you will, with the Globe and Mail on antibiotic resistance. And we put out a number of different articles that helped to shift the way people thought about antibiotic resistance and even helped to convince the government that maybe, just maybe, we should be having bans on certain antibiotics in agriculture. I like to call it antibiotic abstinence in agriculture.
Right.
So what ends up happening is that a microbe, when it comes into contact with an antibiotic at a certain concentration, dies. That's the way we like it. However, if that concentration isn't high enough, then the microbe will get injured and then repair. And when that repair happens, it learns. It's kind of like a, prokaryotic AI, if you will. And so when it learns, it essentially becomes resistant to that antibiotic at that dose. Mm-hmm. Now, what we used to think was, well, we just increase the dose and that would work, except that continually happened. And anyone who is a Next Generation fan will realize that no matter how strong you get, when the Borg have finally figured out, the phaser, you're screwed.
Resistance is futile.
Exactly. So here's where the "you're screwed" comes in. This doesn't just happen with one antibiotic with some of these bacteria. It can happen with multiple antibiotics, multi-drug resistant organisms, MDROs, as we like to call them. And so that happened. And so we've now had to decide, well, how are we going to be able to treat this? So everywhere from the World Health Organization all the way down to public health laboratories have come up with ways to be able to develop, algorithms to figure out how to deal with resistance so that you can use antibiotics in a way that will get rid of the infection. Now we have what are known as pan-resistant organisms. So what this means is they are resistant to all the appropriate antibiotics.
Jesus.
Yeah. So that started in 2011 with Neisseria gonorrhea. And we're now starting to see a number of other species become pan-drug resistant. And that's getting to a point where we're not going to have any choice. And I think it was around this time last year where we heard about a case in the United States where a woman ended up with a mild infection. Unfortunately, it happened to be with one of these pan-drug resistant organisms. And she unfortunately died, and it really started to wake up the public.
So how big of a threat is this? Like, you hear every day, oh, this is the big thing, and you have to watch out for this. But this sounds kind of terrifying, as a parent, as a human, on someone who's kind of on Team Human. This sounds horrifying. Is that an overstatement?
It can be horrifying. But remember, the majority of these infections are preventable. And so if we focus on, our own hygiene, that's going to help to reduce the chances. We do have infections that occur in hospitals, and one of my foci in the sort of the research world is reducing the chances of infection in hospitals and other healthcare facilities. When that happens, it really is a nightmare. And there are some people that you could talk to who have gone through this, and I mean, that in itself is a horror story.
The whole C. diff, that's what you're talking about, right?
Well, not just C. diff. We've seen pneumonias occur. We've seen, when you have an implant, well, that implant can end up leading to an infection if it's not done properly. Right. We've seen it with organ transplantation. So these types of infections can occur, and there are ways of being able to prevent them. The hard part is getting organizations to get involved in the process of ensuring that these infections don't happen. It's an entirely insane world. And if you were to step in it, you would realize that, wow, that there's so much we are still just learning. So from a horror perspective, if we're talking about a horror movie, these antibiotic-resistant bacteria, they're a lot less like Freddy and Jigsaw, thankfully, and they're really more like Jason Voorhees. And yes, I know my name is Jason too, but the fact is, if you don't go to the lake and to a summer camp and, frolic around with the girlfriend that you probably shouldn't, there's a good likelihood you're not going to get killed.
I love the movie analogies. It's great. So, but why is it we're in 2018, almost 2019 now, and penicillin is kind of like that's our best tool that we have. Like, it was basically invented by accident, eons ago. Like, so do you think we kind of took our foot off and when I say we, like, I'm not a scientist, I was an English major, right? So do you think we as a society kind of took our foot off the gas pedal because we thought we just had the solution, and have we not been looking for the next thing?
Oh, yeah. Back in the 1950s and 60s, we really thought we had the battle won. And so what ended up happening was, despite the fact, okay, I got to take you back a few seconds here.
Yeah.
1945, all right, we had the first sort of major release of antibiotics, which was great. Later on that year, there was a paper that was published that said, oh, by the way, we have a bacterium that is resistant to that. We might want to think about that. And everyone went, nah, it's fine. Uh, then come 1976, after we had figured that we've won the war, we're going to be fantastic, and you're never going to have to worry about bacterial infections again. We had the first drug-resistant gonorrhea show up that was obviously not doing what it was told, which was to die. And that also sparked an alarm, but the majority of people went, no, don't worry about it. It really wasn't until 2014 when all of a sudden the World Health Organization called it a crisis that anyone started to really listen. Unfortunately, it's a few years down the road, and so the bacteria have had a chance to really, develop and evolve this resistance and then spread worldwide, and now we're just trying to play catch up.
It's kind of discouraging. We're sending probes to Mars, and we've got cars that can drive themselves, and we're still using, the basically the same antibiotics we came up with so long ago. Now, a lot of people are saying that AI could be a game changer, and I don't know how closely you're following this or if you agree, but they're saying that basically when we get to that certain point where we come up with like legit AI, that the amount of discoveries and just computing capability will be exponential. Like it'll make it look like we're in the Stone Age right now. And I think it was on Joe Rogan had a guy on his podcast a couple of weeks ago that said, when we get to that point, the singularity, that could be the equivalent of 10 Nobel Prize winning discoveries made like every single day. Do you think that kind of promise is held in AI in the years to come?
Well, yes and no. And here's why. The first thing is that AI is absolutely amazing, and it is going to take us into places that we've never really thought about in the past. Okay? That's wonderful. But do you remember Tay?
Tay.
Okay, Tay was the Microsoft AI that they unleashed onto the internet in the hopes of being able to develop an actual person, if you will, who could then converse with others on Twitter and on social media in a way.
Is that the one that went super dark, super fast?
Yeah. And here's why.
Right.
When you completely democratize without any kind of security or any type of stopgaps, then what ends up happening is that the AI is going to essentially head in a certain direction. And the best word to describe that is dank.
Well, because that's a reflection of humans. Is that not the case?
There you go.
Yeah.
So what we need to do is we need to somehow figure out a way that we can utilize AI in a way that it's going to continue to be beneficial. How is that going to happen? Well, as you'll find out in this week's podcast, the answer is blockchain. So what blockchain is it's a way of being able to transparently and securely perform transactions. Now, we all hear about how that leads to money, like cryptocurrencies, but as you find out on the show, there are other ways that you can benefit, including knowledge, including better clinical trials, and even something that Anne Connolly, who, by the way, is just an amazing member of the faculty at Singularity University, calls impact. And that can help from, bartering on the streets of Toronto to helping a country that's trying to develop and grow out of poverty.
So one of the things that I want to ask you about while I have you on the phone, it was an article that on the line. It was an article that I saw earlier today, and it's popped up in a couple of media training sessions that I've done in the medical community, and people are a little freaked out about it, and it seems to be a pretty legitimate concern. Is this AFM, or acute flaccid myelitis? So it's and you can maybe describe it in a better sense, but it's a very small number of people who are affected, primarily children, and they're basically paralyzed, partially or completely paralyzed. They can't move themselves, and then a lot of times they're not recovering. Like it might take months, maybe years, and a lot of them aren't getting back full range of motion. No one knows what it is, why it's being spread. It's kind of like they're comparing it to polio. Like again, this seems to me like how freaked out should we be about this as parents, as Canadians?
Well, here in Canada, thankfully, the numbers are not nearly as high as they are in the United States. However, there are certain portions of the country, like British Columbia, where we do see higher numbers. The big issue with respect to AFM is really the fact that we haven't been able to identify what's causing it in time, because what you see through the paralysis is really a delayed reaction. So the kids, and there are older individuals as well, they get sick, but the symptoms don't happen for a few weeks or a bit longer. And so the virus that has caused this is gone.
Right.
So there are a number of different viruses that have the capability of causing this, okay? And what we're learning is that a few of them, and you've probably heard about, the enterovirus D68 and stuff like that. Several of them are becoming more and more seen, if you will, simply because we're trying to catch them earlier. Mm-hmm. I've been talking with some people who are trying to, shorten the amount of time between an infection and possible paralysis, because there may be a way to be able to prevent that. But we've got to get there in time to find out, what is causing it, and then can we find a way to prevent those, what we call sequelae, secondary effects that can lead to, the paralysis. We're getting there. It's still very, very new. I mean, we've only really been encountering this since about 2014. Mm. But what we do sense is that it seems to be on a 2-year cycle where you start seeing the rise in cases. And 2018 was the second year, so next year shouldn't be too bad. And when you look at some of the other viruses that we know about that could potentially lead to paralysis, there always seems to be this link between higher relative humidity and higher numbers of infections. So most likely what's happening is that it's spreading everywhere, much like you would see with the common cold. It's just that some individuals just don't have the immunity to be able to stop it from going systemic. And then once it gets into the cerebral spinal fluid, that in itself can be a problem, because that's when it can lead to the infection of the areas that control your movement.
Do you think there's any chance, and I know this is pure speculation, but do you think there's any chance that we will figure something out, again, I'm throwing myself into the collective we here, that will help the kids who have these secondary complications, this paralysis, or is that just kind of, that's how they're going to be now?
That, unfortunately, is sort of outside of the realm of microbiology, immunology, and really goes into the neuroscience. Because is the effect that's happening, that's leading to the paralysis, destructive like we see in arthritis? Or is it more along the lines of, reducing certain signals as a result of, shutting down some particular neurons, and can we get those back? We don't have those answers as of yet. As we start to see more and more of these children improve or not improve, it'll give us perspective as to what's going on. Thankfully, we do know the region of the spinal cord that is usually most affected. And so if we can focus on those areas with these children, it may help us to get to a point where we're more comfortable being able to identify how to help down the line. Prevention is always going to be the best option. And so, whether we end up having another vaccine or whether we find some way to treat these viruses, because you can use antivirals, then that may help us to lower the caseload. And then eventually, I don't know if we're ever going to see it completely disappear, because we still haven't eradicated polio yet, but we may get to a point where, the risk is so small that, we don't have to worry about it.
So given what you know and what you do for a living, are you a flu shot guy? Like, do you get that every year?
I get the flu shot when I know that it is a new strain that I haven't seen before.
Okay.
We had a few bad years because the actual virus had mutated or evolved, as I like to call it,
Right.
in the amount of time that it took to develop the vaccine. So you're going to hear a lot of people complain that, oh, it just doesn't work. Well, it does work. And this year it is going to work. And if, you haven't had the vaccine over the last few years, definitely something to consider getting.
And a lot of times it's not so much about the vaccine for yourself. For example, if you have someone who says, oh, my immune system's great, I never get sick, isn't it about being in line at the grocery store with the parent who's got a child who had cancer and has a compromised immune system? Like, isn't that why we should be getting it?
Well, I mean, yeah. Most people may not necessarily care about the kid who's beside the parents.
Well, isn't that kind of a problem we should look at as well? Like, why don't we care about the kid?
Well, to be honest with you, that's really the case when it comes to most anti-vaccination campaigns. It's care for yourself and to heck with the rest. So when we hear about these, messages about trying to make sure that we're protecting the rest of the population, that's going to fall on deaf ears about 3/10 of the time. What you really need to do is essentially say, you don't want to be giving that to grandma or to grandpa, or if dad and mom happen to be over 50 years of age, them, because the immune system is weakening as we get older.
Right.
I'm 47, so I'm still like at a point where my immune system's okay, and so I'm living it up. I'm just going out there, I'm eating dirt and all that type of stuff. As soon as I hit 50, it's like, it's over.
Oh man, I'm 50 now, so I should be bathing in Purell a couple times a day.
Yeah. Exactly. Just,
great.
Keep the Purell everywhere you go. No,
Jeez.
Seriously, though, what we do want to do is for people who are over the age of 65, that's really the critical number. We want to be sure that we're staying vaccinated so that we lessen the likelihood that they're going to have an infection. And one thing I do need to point out to everyone who's listening is that flu infects you and multiplies in you before you have symptoms, because a symptom is actually your immune system. It's not the virus.
Right.
So you may have a flu virus, and it may be a mild one for you because your immune system is rocking on, but then you're
spreading it.
Grandma,
you don't even know.
Give grandma a hug, and next thing you know, she's coming down and she's not well, and she ends up in the hospital, and
You killed grandma for Christmas.
Well, that's it. And the thing is that Santa wants to do it, so don't take away his opportunity, because that reindeer needs to run over somebody.
Santa wants to kill grandma. Exactly. Isn't also, though, that there's a lot of false information out there? Like, I did an interview a couple years ago with a woman who's in charge of infectious diseases at Mount Sinai, I believe. And she was saying that, look, you can go on Google, and on page 1, you can find a ton of articles saying that vaccines are terrible for you, and there's all these toxins in them and all these side effects, and the whole Jenny McCarthy sort of tinfoil hat, and the debunked autism link, which still, even though it's debunked, is still there. She says, but if you could actually have people sit down and do the appropriate amount of research on this, the first thing is it would take you about 2 weeks to do it. But the second thing is anyone who did it would be like slam dunk vaccines every single time. So isn't it also another byproduct of social media, or the ability for people who are floating ideas out there to get them on the first page of Google, and it really isn't serving the general public? Like, isn't that a kind of an uphill battle?
Well, it is. But let me tell you something. Allison and Don Lowe and Michael Gardam, myself, a number of years ago, we were everywhere. You could see us absolutely everywhere, right? You don't see Allison McGeer very often on TV. You don't see me very often on TV. Don Lowe, bless his heart, he's passed away. Michael Gardam has gone on to do something else. I mean, the voices that were there to counter the anti-vaccine movement are no longer around. Those people have never gone away, the anti-vaccine people. They've been around since probably the, late 90s. And I've been dealing with them since 2007 when I first started going into the media. The problem is that the voices who have been there to help Canadians and others understand that vaccines are safe, that vaccines are good for you, that vaccines do something for you, have simply not had an opportunity to become those vocal champions for vaccines like we had in the past. And unfortunately, as a result of that, we have been seeing a shift in momentum. So really, it's not about the fact that the anti-vaxxers have gained momentum. It's the fact that there's now been this imbalance in the messaging, and we're losing out.
And in a way, isn't that kind of what you're trying to combat with your podcast? Like, and not the vaccination specifically, but, you know, to have a platform, that's probably one of the side effects of that, is to fill that void a little bit, right?
Well, that's one of them, and having people come on and talking about research in a human way helps to develop trust in researchers and therefore the science. But one of the things that the podcast also does is it gives you perspectives that you're never going to hear. We did an episode on climate change, and rather than getting into the arguments of the blue side versus the red side, which I'm sure you've heard about, right?
Right.
I went and provided some support for the argument that climate change is being, helped by humans, and read a nice little declaration as to how this is happening and what needs to get done. And then I revealed the source. It's the Vatican. So the fact is that if the Vatican is coming on board to something like climate change, then perhaps the people who are listening are going to have a little bit less of that skepticism because it's just scientists, all 97% of them. But in reality, it's other members of the community who we trust, who we talk to, who we see on a daily basis, who are also falling in line. And one of the things that we talk about in the show is how we are seeing people becoming more and more, they're putting more credence in climate change because they're seeing the damage firsthand. When you look at what happened down south with Florence and Michael, you're seeing people now going, you know what, this climate change thing is real. We got to do something about it. When a week before that or a month before that, they were saying, no, that's just something that's made up. When you look at these controversial issues, what you find is that those who are opposed to the science don't use science. What they end up doing is they start talking about things that sound like science, but really aren't. And my favorite of all times with respect to global warming was this article that appeared on a right-wing news source that said that we have evidence that the climate is cooling. The world is getting colder. You know what they did? They took temperatures from July 1st to December 21st. Well, duh. So that's the thing, is that the more that we have voices like myself, like the researchers I interview out there, you're going to have more trust in us. And really, that's what the show is about. And the beautiful thing is that when you're talking with some of these people, you really are showing them some sass. And I just want to give you one last example with respect to this, okay? Sure. We had a Zika virus problem a few years ago, right?
Yeah.
And I ended up being on another right-wing talk show to discuss this, because this person believed that Zika virus and its effects on the baby was all a hoax, and that it was actually being done by Planned Parenthood in order to justify abortions. Wow. Now, completely ridiculous, right? Yeah. But he gave me an opportunity to talk on the show about Zika virus. And so I essentially changed it in a way that made it very relevant to him. See, he lives in New Jersey, and they had Sandy, which came in. And I don't know if you remember, but it pretty much messed up that whole coastal area.
Oh, yeah, very bad.
And so I talked to him about that, and we got a little bit into how Sandy was affecting it, et cetera, et cetera. And, the roller coaster in the sea, the boardwalk completely destroyed, the waterfront is, a mess. And he was asking, well, does Zika virus have anything to do with hurricanes? I said, no, that effect that you're seeing as a result of Sandy is the same thing that Zika does to babies' brains. And at that moment, he had nowhere to go. And so what ended up happening is we got into a discussion about how we can implement maternal health strategies to be able to help women be able to have proper pregnancies so that they don't have to worry about a Zika virus or gestational diabetes or preeclampsia. And we actually stayed in the scientific realm, no matter how much he really wanted to turn it into a Planned Parenthood wants abortion story.
You sort of argued him into the box.
Exactly.
Nicely done.
And when you do that, and all scientists can do this, what ends up happening is that their arguments are seen for what they are, which is thin-veiled attempts to utilize science as a way to, push a political agenda. It goes away. And right now, we're seeing a lot of that happening here in Canada. And everybody who's out there, I just recommend have some fun with the science and have some sass so that when you see a political statement that's not based on any science whatsoever, or is even worse, trying to, take advantage of science for their own political view, you simply put that aside and say, you know what? No, nice try, but, try again.
So there's one thing I'd like to ask you about before we go. Obviously, you're aware of the issues and the problems that Facebook's having these days with just trampling on people's privacy and selling information, and sort of new exposés are coming out on a sort of weekly basis. Saw something the other day that someone said, if you think you are shocked and freaked out about what Facebook has been doing to you, wait until you see what companies like 23andMe are doing with your DNA down the road. Do you think that's a valid concern?
Again, this is where something like blockchain is going to be able to come into this and essentially level out the field. Okay? Because what's going to happen is and we talk with someone who's actually developing this for healthcare on the show. What we're going to have is the ability to determine what is shared in a transaction. And then that transaction becomes transparent for everyone to see. So if 23andMe has your genetic information and starts to share it, you'll know about it because you're part of the blockchain, because it initially started with your data. And then if they do anything that's untoward, you're going to see it, and then you're going to have the ability to say to them either A, stop, or B, hey, here's a nice little subpoena for you.
But that's an ideal scenario, right? To have a blockchain organizing everything, and then it's a public ledger. But there was the story, was it like last year, the Golden State Killer, the guy from the 70s, or he did like more than 50 rapes and 100 burglaries from like 74 to like 85 or 86 or something like that. And they caught him because they got some of his DNA and they tracked it down to like one of his relatives who had submitted their DNA to the service. So like until we get the whole blockchain thing figured out, it seems like, I think a lot of us as consumers expect that you're going to have a certain level of service and or privacy. And as we're seeing with these social media platforms, in some cases, it depends on the leadership. And with Facebook, it seems like everything's for sale. And so, do you think that people who, grab the kit, lick the thing and send it in the mail should they be doing that? Or is that kind of a mistake?
Well, I mean, how many times have you ever read the end user agreement on a piece of software you've downloaded?
Oh, every time. No, I've never read that.
Yeah, exactly. I just accept all right, whatever. Yeah. Just don't do anything untoward.
Right.
Well, the thing is that these companies will provide you with sort of an end user or a supplement agreement or informed donor consent, whatever it may be. Read through that, because they're then going to tell you where and who they can share that information. And so if you disagree with it, then keep your spit in your mouth.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is that we're already at a point now where we're seeing this idea of widespread genetic testing, whether it be for your spit or your poop. Don't forget, we can do microbiome now.
Right.
People are just doing this because they think it's going to be a great source of information, and it's going to make them decide whether or not, they should wear a kilt or lederhosen. That's wonderful. Right. But if you're not sure where your data is going, or you're not comfortable with where your data can go, then it's probably better just not to know until we've sorted out all the transparency and security. Now, what's really interesting is that with 23andMe, they've already had to work with the FDA in order to stay alive. So that process, that algorithm, that roadmap to being able to see what is going to happen with your information is already starting. but we're still not at a point where I would spit into one of these yet.
Okay, so that's enough information for me. I don't think I'm going to do that at any point in the future. Jason Tetro, I want to say thank you very much for being with us today. A pleasure to chat with you. Wealth of information. I hope we can do this again. And I'm going to encourage everyone to check out your show. As soon as we get done, I'm going to finish listening to the episode that I was on earlier, and I've subscribed to it earlier today, and I recommend everybody else does as well. Super awesome science show. You can get it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you very much.
Oh, no worries. That was lots of fun.
Thank you once again to Jason Tetro for his time, and I really encourage you to check out his new podcast, The Super Awesome Science Show. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You may have noticed I don't include ads in this podcast. I think they're annoying to the listener, but the one favor I would ask is to please take 2 seconds to go over to Apple Podcasts and either rate the show or leave a review. It would mean a lot, and it'll help other people to find this show. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.